My name is Sandra, and I am an architect by profession. I have dedicated my life to creating unique spaces where every detail matters, and this monumental day was no exception. However, today I am not just a professional, I am a bride, with a heart full of excitement and anticipation. This day is special to me, and I poured not only my expertise but my entire soul into its preparation. Every detail was meticulously thought out, from the flowers to the playlist, which was meant to be the perfect soundtrack to our evening. I dreamed that our wedding would be like a refined romance, a testament to the great power of love that binds Peter and me. Peter, my groom, stood at the altar, waiting for me with the same confidence he approaches his work as an engineer. His outlook on life has always been pragmatic and straightforward, and it was in this that we found our harmony. His practicality perfectly complemented my creative impulses. I always knew we were two halves of a whole, our strengths enhancing each other, creating the balance I had long sought. The start of a new chapter with him was supposed to be filled with joy, and indeed, a sense of happiness filled me as I walked toward the altar. However, as soon as our eyes met, I noticed something that made me furrow my brow slightly. His eyes, usually so warm and alive, now seemed distant, burdened by some invisible weight. I tried to attribute it to natural nervousness before such an important moment, but the closer I got, the more doubts crept into my heart. Everything became even more tense when I caught a hushed whisper from Peter's mother, Jane, standing nearby. Her gaze was scrutinizing, almost disapproving, though she tried to smile and tell me how beautiful I looked. But her eyes said otherwise. The ceremony continued, and when it came time for Peter to say his vows, the silence that suddenly hung in the air felt endless. The moment he finally said, "I do," I felt his words lacked the warmth I had been so sure of in our past. During the exchange of rings, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but each moment became increasingly unsettling. Jane, as if determined to capture every moment, insisted on photos with an almost obsessive fervor. Her words, though they sounded like innocent wishes to preserve memories of the event, seemed to me like barely veiled warnings. At the reception, while I was talking with old friends, she appeared once again, and her comments about my dress, subtly critical, though wrapped in compliments, made me feel uneasy once more. Though she admired its beauty, she emphasized that it strayed from traditional norms. I tried to respond with a light smile, pointing out that we were celebrating our love in our unique style. At that moment, Peter stepped in, asking his mother to give us some personal space. At first, I thought he was defending us, our choice, our wedding. But his words sounded less like support and more like concession. The song, which had initially been intended as a symbol of joy and celebration of our union, now seemed like a cruel joke. The music faded, and Peter's attempts to console me only highlighted the growing chasm between us. His words offered no comfort. Instead, they echoed the hollow void inside me that I could no longer ignore. At one point, he ironically asked if I was ready for eternity, and that question seemed to weigh heavily on my soul, reminding me of the doubts I had desperately tried to hide. I wanted to tell him the truth, to voice my fears and worries, to question whether our future would be overshadowed by what was happening that day. But instead, I masked my feelings with restraint, afraid of shattering even this fragile illusion of happiness. I hoped, despite everything, that this darkness would lift, that everything that seemed difficult now was merely temporary clouds on our horizon. It felt like just a rocky start, no more than a test that we could overcome together. I didn't know then that this day was merely the prelude to a far more complex and painful period. This period would test not only our marriage but the very essence of who I was. The celebratory toasts and congratulations on that day brought no solace. They sounded hollow, as if each word was framed by an invisible sadness. And while the outside world seemed festive, something inside me was irreversibly breaking. When we returned to our home, a charming three-bedroom cottage that I had lovingly designed and decorated, I hoped that here, in our cozy nest, we would begin the new chapter of our lives. This house was a symbol of my independence and hard work, and I believed it would be the foundation for our shared future. But instead, it became an arena for battles, the beginning of a series of arguments and silences that felt like an intrusion into my life, not the start of happiness. Jane, Peter's mother, lived just a few minutes away by car. Her visits became so frequent that I anxiously awaited the next knock on the door. Each of her arrivals was accompanied by a wave of criticism aimed at everything that surrounded me, from my cooking to the design of our home. She found flaws in everything. Either my cooking was too bland, or the tiles in the bathroom were completely inappropriate. Each of her phrases sounded like a well-disguised insult, even when she tried to appear polite. Peter's attempts to intervene were barely noticeable. His support seemed more superficial, formal, than genuine. He rarely tried to take my side, and when he did, it seemed more out of obligation than a sincere desire to defend me. Jane continued her intrusion into our lives, using each visit as an opportunity to assert her superiority, her dominance in our family. Her criticism knew no bounds. The real breaking point came the day she arrived at our home with suitcases. She entered the house with clear determination, her intentions unmistakable. This wasn't just another visit, it was an occupation. Jane announced that she would now be living with us, her voice making it sound as though there was no other option. With those words, she walked past me, ignoring my attempts to object, and claimed my favorite corner by the window, which had always been my sanctuary, a place for reading in moments of peace. "This spot will be just perfect for me," she said with such confidence that I felt a knot tighten inside me. I turned to Peter, expecting him to step in, to say something to remind me that this was our home, that we were the ones who should be making decisions. My gaze was full of pleading, but his eyes were cold, devoid of the love and warmth that once seemed so constant. "Mom is getting older, Sandra," he said, his voice quiet but filled with finality. "She needs to be with family. It's not right for her to stay alone." He stressed the word family in such a way that I felt completely excluded. Those words, barely out of his mouth, cut deeper than I could have anticipated. It was as if I wasn't part of this family. Tears of hurt and disappointment welled up in my eyes, and I couldn't hold them back. Peter, barely noticing my emotions, quickly cut off his thought, his tone becoming irritated, as if my state burdened him. "You know that's not what I meant," he said, but his words felt empty. "I owe it to her, Sandra." I felt a wave of pain and despair rise within me. "And what about us? What about us, Peter? Don't we owe each other more? We're supposed to be building our life, not living with your mother." I tried to break through the wall of his indifference. But my words bounced off him like cold stone. I already knew he wasn't going to back down. My fears, my feelings seemed insignificant to him, not worthy of consideration. And so, Jane's move into our home was decided. My wishes held no weight in this equation. With her arrival, everything in the house changed. Every corner, every room that once held our dreams and plans was now filled with tension. My favorite reading nook, once a place for solitude and calm, was overtaken by her belongings. The kitchen became a battlefield, where every meal I cooked became the subject of her harsh criticism. It felt like even the air in our home was saturated with her presence, her judgment. Peter, the man I had promised to spend my life with, increasingly seemed like Jane's ally, not mine. He defended her, justified her, while my feelings and pleas went unnoticed. I began to realize that I wasn't just fighting for our marriage or my personal space, I was fighting for my dignity. The sense of losing my voice, my significance, became overwhelming. Every day, I felt more displaced, my dreams and desires drowning under the weight of her demands. That realization hit me when I stood in the bathroom, holding a pregnancy test in my hands. Two blue lines, a familiar symbol of new life, should have been a moment of joy and celebration. I had always imagined that finding out I was pregnant would be one of the happiest moments of my life. But standing there alone, all I felt was fear and the heavy weight of responsibility. Tears welled up as I stared at my reflection in the mirror, searching for an answer in my own emotions. What should have been a bright moment had turned into a heavy burden. When I finally decided to share the news with Peter, his reaction broke my heart. I had hoped he would, if only for a moment, set aside his indifference and embrace this important moment with me. But instead, he merely muttered, "Well, that's something," and, as if nothing significant had happened, quickly shifted the conversation to a renovation idea his mother had suggested. From the very beginning, when my pregnancy was revealed, it became clear that for Jane, it wasn't just joyful news, it was a new project she intended to control down to the smallest detail. Under the guise of caring help, she took charge of every aspect of my condition, from what I should eat to where I should give birth. Her interference quickly became tyranny. Every meal I had was under her scrutinizing gaze, as if she suspected I was making mistakes, even with the simplest choices. "Doctors these days don't know anything," she once said dismissively when I assured her I was following the diet recommended by my physician. Jane, however, was convinced that her old-fashioned beliefs, seemingly rooted in a bygone era, carried more weight than modern medical advice. As my pregnancy progressed, her demands became more outrageous. Our home, which Peter and I had built as a cozy nest, had turned into her domain. Jane expected me to maintain it in perfect order according to her standards, despite the fact that, as a pregnant woman, I needed rest. "Sandra, why is the living room such a mess?" she exclaimed indignantly, demanding explanations when all I wanted was a moment of peace. My once cozy reading nook, a haven for quiet reflection, had been taken from me, transformed into her base for endless scrolling on her phone and watching TV. All my protests, all my attempts to explain that I was exhausted, fell on deaf ears. Jane insisted that pregnancy was no excuse for laziness. Every remark, every rebuke added more tension to the atmosphere in the house. Peter's silence during these moments became unbearable. His inaction, his refusal to take my side or even support me, made our life together more and more painful. This was especially true at dinner when an argument flared up over the name for our baby. Jane made no effort to hide her disdain for the name I had chosen, and her criticism became the final straw for me. "Jane, this is my child, and I will decide how to raise them." My words sounded like a challenge, a final attempt to defend not just my point of view but my right to my own life. But Peter, instead of supporting me, once again took his mother's side. His comment that I was just being too emotional pierced me like a knife. This wasn't just a disagreement over a baby name. It was about preserving my dignity and sense of self-worth in a world where I was slowly being pushed aside. My voice mattered less and less in our home. I no longer felt like part of this family, let alone part of my own decisions. Every time I looked at my once sparkling wedding ring, I barely recognized the woman I used to be, confident, full of hopes and dreams. Now, I stood as a shadow of that woman, losing everything that once mattered: my refuge, my sense of dignity, and most painfully, my ability to stand up for myself. During one of our particularly sharp confrontations, Jane, sensing her inevitable victory, uttered a phrase that changed everything. "Maybe you just don't belong in our family if you can't handle such a simple family disagreement." Her words echoed in my mind, leaving behind a searing sensation of pain and humiliation. But even more painful was Peter's reaction, his complete lack of response. His silence was louder than any words. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a temporary trial, it had become my reality. Days began to blur together, turning into an endless stream of struggle where I fought to hold on to even a shred of my own voice and dignity. Walking through the corridors of the house that once felt like home, I no longer felt connected to these walls. Every corner reminded me of what had once been mine, but now this place seemed to have lost its soul, filled with dreams and hopes that Peter and I had once cherished. The only spark of hope I still held onto was the child growing inside me. Yet even that precious life felt under threat in an atmosphere steeped in toxicity and tension, which drained my strength day by day. The moment came when I could no longer hide my pain and resentment. It happened on a cold evening, during yet another dinner I had carefully prepared, hoping to please. But once again, all my efforts turned into a barrage of attacks from Jane. The criticism fell like icy rain, burning mercilessly. She nitpicked over the smallest details, from the salt in the food to the spices I had chosen. Each of her comments dripped with such contempt that it felt like her words turned into blows, destroying the last remnants of my self-confidence. But this wasn't just about dinner. It was an attack on me as a future mother. When Jane implied that I couldn't handle my household duties, insinuating that I wouldn't be a good mother, something inside me snapped. Peter, sitting beside her, nodding indifferently in agreement with her words, delivered the final blow. I could no longer contain the pent-up pain and anger. "I'm carrying your child, taking care of our home, and enduring constant humiliation from your mother." My voice cut through the silence like a knife. I saw the shock on their faces, but I could no longer afford to stay silent. For too long, I had endured, allowing myself to be belittled and my feelings dismissed. In that moment, I realized I had reclaimed my voice, which had been stifled for years. "I'm done. I can't take this anymore," I added, with a clarity that had been building within me for some time. It wasn't just a statement, it was an act of liberation, a step towards finally ending this torment. My voice trembled as I spoke, but my resolve was unwavering. I no longer wanted to raise my child in a home where their mother was constantly humiliated. If this was family, as Jane and Peter envisioned it, then I wanted no part of this illusion. My decision was final, and it gave me the strength to rise and leave the table. They watched me in stunned silence, taken aback by the sudden turn of events. In that silence, my footsteps echoed as I began gathering only the essentials. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, knowing that this moment would mark the final break. But even then, Jane couldn't hold back her spite. "And where do you think you're going? This is Peter's house, not yours," she spat out with bitter coldness. I stopped and turned to her, my determination growing stronger with every word she uttered. "Actually, Jane, this is my house. I bought it. And I decide who stays and who goes. My voice was full of both confidence and desperation. It was a moment of truth where I finally raised my voice. Peter, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a hint of pleading in his voice. "Sandra, please, let's talk about this." But I was past the point of negotiation. There was no room left in my heart for compromise. "There's nothing left to discuss," I replied, and the tears in my eyes were not from pain but from the realization of the inevitability of my decision. As I stepped into the cold night, it felt like crossing into a new chapter of my life. The uncertainty of the future filled me, but at the same time, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't known in a long time. The door closing behind me symbolized the end of a tumultuous chapter, the final point in a life I could no longer endure. With each step that took me farther from what I once called home, I felt both pain and determination intertwined in a tight knot. It seemed like every minute on the road to my parents' house lasted forever. The cold wind cut to the bone, but it couldn't compare to the chill that had settled in my soul. Every part of this journey wasn't just a physical distance, but a path inward, toward the Sandra I had long lost. When I stumbled on the sidewalk and fell, the pain that shot through my body made me freeze for a moment. But that fall was insignificant compared to the wounds tearing at my soul. This hit against the ground was just a reminder of everything I had already endured and how much more I had yet to overcome. Still, the fall didn't stop me. On the contrary, it strengthened my resolve. I would no longer allow myself to be broken, either physically or emotionally. Finally, when I arrived at my parents' house, I saw the worry and fear in their eyes. It was a look full of sympathy, but also of understanding that I was at the edge. They didn't ask anything right away, simply accepted me, as if they already knew I hadn't come back without reason. Soon I found myself in the hospital, and as I lay on the cold bed, I realized that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A transition, painful like the tearing of skin, but inevitable and necessary. Every moment, every movement in that hospital corridor echoed in my mind like a loud signal. There was no turning back. Returning to my old life would have been a betrayal of myself and my child. My former life, shattered piece by piece, could no longer serve as the foundation for a new future. This moment was a turning point, the embodiment of a shift toward healing and reclaiming independence. Around me, my parents stood, their care wrapping around me like a warm blanket shielding me from the world. My mother gently asked, "Sandra, what are you going to do now? What's your plan?" Her voice was full of worry, and I knew she was trying to prepare me for the challenges ahead. I looked into her eyes and answered, feeling the words fall into place, uncertain but firm. "Mom, I'm not exactly sure what's next, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going back to that life. Not now, not ever." My words were stronger than I expected. I felt my determination growing inside me, gradually replacing the hopelessness that had recently seemed insurmountable. My father, who had been pacing the room, occasionally stopping to glance at me, finally came closer. His presence was quiet but steady. He didn't say anything unnecessary, only repeated what I already knew but perhaps needed to hear. "Your mother and I will always be here. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." His words stirred something deeper within me, the realization that I wasn't just fighting for myself now, but for the life growing inside me. At that moment, everything became even clearer. There was no doubt that I had to fight not only for my future but for my child's future as well. These thoughts swirled in my mind like a storm, each offering a new scenario, but they all led to one conclusion: I needed to start fresh. Suddenly, my phone rang, interrupting this stream of thoughts. A message from Peter. He wanted to talk. For a moment, I froze, but then I realized it was over. That door had long closed for us. His words, his plea no longer meant anything to me. Turning off the phone, I cut off the dialogue for good, making his silence the final page of our story. My next steps were clear. It was actions, not words, that would speak for me now. The first thing I did was contact a family lawyer. This step marked the beginning of the end of our marriage. My parents and I worked through all the discussions about child custody, property division, and financial support. These conversations were cold and lifeless, but they opened the door to a new life where I could finally take control of my fate and secure a future not just for myself, but for my child. Only a week had passed when Peter's and Jane's world began to crumble under the weight of official notices. Peter received the divorce papers, and Jane was served with an eviction order for the house, which, as it turned out, legally belonged to me. Each of these documents carried the final chords of the relationship that had held me captive in despair for so long. Requests for substantial alimony and compensation for the emotional suffering I had endured were the logical conclusion of the radical steps I had taken. When I finally picked up my phone after all of this, it was flooded with messages from Peter. His words swung between regret and timid attempts at reconciliation, but what could his apologies change? The years of humiliation and constant disregard, the nights when I was broken by Jane's toxic words and manipulations, all flashed before my eyes like a black and white film. Peter, who had been silent when his voice would have meant so much to me, was now trying to speak, but it was too late. For a brief moment, I wondered, what if I gave him a chance? But the temptation was immediately shattered by memories. Every moment of his inaction, every minute he allowed his mother to mock me was too fresh to be forgotten. I understood that this chapter of my life was over, that it was time to reclaim control and stop letting the past dictate my future. The love I had once felt for Peter was entirely eclipsed by sadness and disappointment. All that remained of our marriage was bitterness, which I now had to free myself from. With a decisive motion, I deleted all his messages, erased his number from my contacts, and blocked him on every social platform. This was the final step to break free, a symbolic gesture that drew a line under the life I was leaving behind. Peter was now just a part of my history, a chapter one was ready to close forever. But I knew that a long and difficult path still lay ahead. Divorce is never easy, but when a child is on the horizon, everything becomes doubly complicated. However, despite all the obstacles, I felt that every step I took was leading me toward freedom, toward a future where I could finally build my life on my own terms, free from the shadows of the past. The day of the court hearing came faster than I expected. The courtroom was cold and sterile, as if every move and every word carried the weight of fate. My lawyer sat beside me, radiating confidence, and my parents quietly observed from the gallery, their silent support giving me strength. Peter sat across from me, his face reflecting confusion, as if he was only now realizing the seriousness of the situation. Jane, who had always been so self-assured, now looked truly shocked. When the hearing began and the judge entered the room, I stood alone with everyone else, feeling a tremble of nervousness course through my body. The proceedings were dry, legal jargon filled the air, accusations and evidence were laid out on the table before us. But in that moment, it seemed that Peter and Jane were seeing their actions not just through the lens of legalities, but through my eyes for the first time. It was their confrontation with reality, a reality they had stubbornly ignored while I suffered. When it was Jane's turn to speak, her usual confidence had vanished. She tried to justify herself, claiming she was concerned about her son's well-being, but her words didn't sound convincing. The judge watched her with evident skepticism, not allowing her words to distract from the core of the case. The verdict, delivered by Judge Nina R. Morrison, was clear and left no room for doubt. I was granted a full divorce and sole custody of our unborn child. Peter was ordered to pay child support, and Jane faced a hefty fine for emotional abuse and harassment. When the judge's gavel hit the wood with a dull thud, sealing my past for good, I was overwhelmed by a sense of liberation mixed with a quiet, inevitable sadness. The freedom I had gained didn't come with dramatic cries or emotional battles, as I might have once imagined. No, it all ended quietly, almost routinely, the rustling of papers, the stern voice of the judge declaring the end of my marriage. So, without fanfare, this chapter of my life closed, clearing the way for a new one, a freedom I had fought so hard to earn. But despite the joy, the cost of that freedom had been high, unpredictably high, for the day when Peter and I had once vowed eternal love to each other. When we walked out of the courtroom, the world felt both unfamiliar and liberated. Peter approached me, his face full of sadness and confusion, as if he had just begun to understand how everything had gone wrong. He looked at me with a sorrowful expression, as though hoping I could somehow undo everything. But as I gazed into his eyes, I no longer saw our future or any chance of reconciliation. Where love had once lived, there was now only a deep, insurmountable void. "I never thought it would end like this, Peter," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "But apologies can't fix what's already happened." I turned away, unwilling to look back any longer. Each step distanced me from the past, allowing me to leave behind the painful years when I silently endured humiliation and neglect. That chapter was over, and no words could change the decision I had already made. Jane stood off to the side, her gaze clinging to me, searching for even the faintest hint of forgiveness or recognition. But I couldn't give her what she was looking for. She had taken too much from me. She didn't deserve to know just how deeply her words and actions had scarred my soul. I kept my face impassive, as though her existence was now nothing more than a memory I chose to erase. As we left the courthouse, the world around me seemed transformed. The sun shone brighter, the colors were more vivid, and every sound felt more alive. It was as if I were seeing life from an entirely new perspective, free from the dark shadows that had clouded my vision for so long. I took a deep breath. It was the first real taste of freedom. My mother's embrace awaited me outside, her words of pride bringing tears to my eyes. "Now you're truly free, Sandra," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you and Dad," I replied, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for their unwavering support, even in the darkest moments. That evening, I spent in the quiet of my home. Now, it was just my home. For the first time in a long while, I felt not simply alone but at peace in my solitude. I was alone, but not lonely. A calmness enveloped me, shielding me from everything that had once caused me pain. I was ready to live by my own rules, free from anyone else's expectations or demands. Of course, the future as a single mother was daunting, and the path ahead seemed full of uncertainties and challenges. But when I felt the slight movement inside me, a reminder of the life I carried within, it gave me comfort. That movement was the source of my confidence, confidence that we would make it through, that what lay ahead wasn't just a struggle but an opportunity to create something new, something real. Yes, the trials I had endured left their marks, but they were symbols of resilience, not defeat. I had walked through the fire and emerged stronger than ever. Now, I knew that my future wasn't just shaped by circumstances, it was my choice. That realization filled me with a strength I had never imagined. I stood at the threshold of a new chapter in my life, one that I would write myself.